Okay. Hi, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for being here today. We are so excited to see everyone here on this cold, blistery autumn Thursday. Tonight's event is part of the longer series in the community education series hosted by the Muskingum County Social Justice Coalition and the Muskingum County Library System, as well as the City of Zanesville, the Convention and Visitors Bureau, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Muskingum County Community Foundation. I just ask everybody to stay muted unless you're speaking, and feel free to use the chat if you have questions or comments that you want to have read later. Also, please note, as you just saw, the session is being recorded, and we appreciate that everyone is here today. We are on number 10. We're on quite a few in the late series of session 3 of the community education series, and I'm really excited to have Mary McCollum back. Our last session with Mary was amazing. We've had so much great feedback about it, and it was an impactful conversation about where we are with race today and where we come from, which, is Mary had said, is where we started with racism in America is exactly where we're at. And so that's something for us to really think about. And I'm excited to welcome her back to talk about diversity. So I will go ahead and share the screen with Mary.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen here. I did a little PowerPoint. And what I thought I wanted to do was just kind of talk about, I know we're getting the pulse of the things that are going on in the community, the communities we share, but I wanted to kind of pay attention to some of the historical responses we have had to diversity. And historically, I mean, colonial America in the United States, and just give some examples of that. And this is something that I think about a lot in terms of why people do what they do. And I think, as someone who has studied and teaches cultural diversity, I'm more interested in the why. It's kind of looking past the behaviors that we see and figuring out what is it that is driving these behaviors. So I wanted to start out just with some basic responses, historical responses to diversity. This is a scenario that actually I used in my multicultural education class, and I thought it would be good to kind of take a brief look at it, because when I first read this, it seemed like what I have experienced in terms of trying to teach diversity, especially in New Concord, where there's more socioeconomic diversity than there is racial and ethnic diversity. So this scenario, something from my first year students, but it talks about Starsville. And I can read it here for you, but it says Starsville was a typical sleepy New England town comprising almost exclusively white middle-class citizens whose families had lived there for generations. As in the case in many small towns, the residents seemed to appreciate the idea that they knew one another and shared similar pastimes, values, beliefs, and ways of living. What little diversity they had within the schools created little controversy. Then one of the churches in town decided to sponsor a family of refugees from Syria in another development due to the close proximity of Starsville to a large metropolitan area. African American and Hispanic families from the city, upwardly mobile professionals, began buying homes in town. Starsville was quickly becoming a diverse community. Town leaders and school officials prided themselves that they had what they considered a very accepting and harmonious school climate. And then things began to change. A gay student was chased home by bullies throwing stones. A group of Mexican American girls were taunted by other girls as they walked through the high school hallways. Racist and homophobic graffiti began appearing around town. Fights were becoming more frequent in school. Derogatory comments about minority students became more common in the teachers' lounge. Of football and drawings of swastikas on walls became more frequent. School officials were alarmed and puzzled by this change in student behavior. Previously, kind and supportive students became intolerant in both behavior and words, fueled by what was appearing in the news. Normally supportive parents became divisive on the causes and solutions. And so this was, I thought, a pretty good assessment of how a lot of places deal with increasing diversity. And in the next few slides, we're going to go back and kind of talk about historically how we've responded. You know, just to throw out a question, is this something that any of you have seen?
Yeah, I think, we've certainly seen it on the news,
Yeah.
and you kind of scratch your head and, like you've been saying, you kind of want to try to understand why people would resist. And,
Mm.
Is it really, just a resistance to change, or do they have perceptions of these people that are different than them? And they're afraid that it's going to negatively affect their neighborhood. I mean, who knows?
Right. Well, those are really good points. When I read this, I immediately thought of New Concord again, because we don't have a great deal of diversity. And I've heard some circumstances in the past of kind of negative reactions, not huge situations, but even little situations can be impactful. And so as I read this and I talked to my students about it, the question was, is this a familiar response? And I'm guessing, because it was in the first chapter of our textbook, that it probably is a pretty familiar response to diversity. And I think that those of us who see circumstances like this think about that why and what can we do to change that. Okay, Daryl, thank you. So you have an experience. So I'm going to move ahead. All right, and so again, this is just a historical snapshot of just a handful of things, and many of them go back to the presentation I gave in June. And that is, historically, in times where we've had a great deal of diversity, or increased diversity in a short period of time, the most common response that we've seen is fear and othering. And so I guess the question is, does this all come from fear? Fear is the initial response, and then we use the language of othering and things like that to make it easier to justify what our responses are. We know that Columbus didn't actually discover America. He didn't even land on America's shores, but he kind of stumbled upon the islands in the Caribbean. And when he met the native populations, he made judgment calls and assumed that they were savages. He didn't understand their ways. He enslaved many of them, took them back to Europe with him as kind of, sideshow attractions. And this didn't stop when Columbus left and we had European contact in the 1600s. That's the same thing that kind of happened. And the European settlers, when they met native populations, again, it was the same response. They didn't understand, and they looked at this group of people who seemingly didn't have religion, who weren't civilized. And the native tribes that were here were more civilized, or just as civilized, but in a different manner. And so initially, the response was to label them as being inferior, and they needed to be civilized. And then we see this response kind of, the fear ended up being replaced, right? And, this definitely happened during the 1800s with the Indian Removal Act and, the movement to the reservation system, that it was, the European descendants were superior. And this was even in some documents that, the European settlers believed that they were superior, right? And so, this idea of manifest destiny and it is our God-given right to move west and conquer everything we see is what they use to justify removing Native peoples from their ancestral lands and putting them on reservations. So here, I mean, they had fear initially, but then they got to where the natives had something that the government wanted, and so they just came in and took it, so that they could sell it to other people moving west. So I mean, it started out as fear, and then it became more assimilation, like they're a problem. And in fact, in a number of documents, people referred to them as the Indian problem. Just like Nazi Germany referred to the Jewish population as the Jewish problem. How are we going to solve this? They became a problem to fix, and not really. There was really no attempt to kind of get to know, and understand the groups. And then if we look, we have a long history of immigration in the United States. And, every group that came here, I would say after the, initial settlers, colonists came here, we've kind of operated on this idea of fear and this idea that, we have some sort of superiority, that the white race or the European descendants have this superiority. And we were able to use this in a number of different ways. For instance, public education, if you look at the history of that, originally public education was supposed to be a great equalizer, and it was supposed to put everybody kind of on a level playing field. But initially, public education was only for young boys and men, and then eventually they allowed women. But in terms of immigrants and in terms of, enslaved peoples, there were limits put on education. If we look at the residential boarding schools that Native children were placed in, I mean, they were taken from their homelands and their families, and they were placed thousands of miles away in one of a number of these different residential boarding schools, and they were educated for assimilation. So what they were taught was English, they were taught religion, they were punished for speaking their native language, punished for, their cultural practices. Their hair was cut. And so the first part of the day for a few hours was spent with this, kind of Americanized, westernized education. And then for the rest of the day, they were in trades. I mean, they were educated to be domestic servants to white individuals, right? Or they were taught, laborious trades like blacksmithing and agriculture and things like that, all in an attempt to get them to be more white, right, or Americanized. And that was a common theme, especially in the late 1800s and early 1900s. You had every new immigrant group that came in faced some sort of discrimination. And, this idea of America being a great melting pot itself is really, a falsehood. We're not a melting pot. But the intention originally was for immigrants to come in and kind of check their culture at the door and become American and forget their language and forget their culture and that kind of thing. So there was this great deal of pressure to assimilate. 1924, we had immigration quotas because the US government looked at the census and wanted to keep the landscape, the demographic landscape, very similar. So you had, the countries that sent, the most immigrants, those numbers were cut down so that everybody was kind of equal. And they tended to favor people from Western Europe, people that looked white, that were Christian, that, were British, German. There have also been petitions for English only and official English laws. So we have I think it's 24 states that have English as an official language. Um, the United States itself does not have an official language. We have never had an official language. Um, but many of the states in border areas have official English laws where, where English has official status, right? Um, in addition, in those places, there were petitions really based on fear that um, non-native speakers and immigrants were somehow going to come in and they were going to take over and they were going to become the majority. Um, and those have been met with, petitions to have students taught only in English and not use their native language. We've seen this in the last 6 or 7 years, this call for a border wall and tightened security. Um, you know, false statements made about people who were coming in to seek asylum. And a lot of that, I think, is based on fear. And some of that also has resulted in violence against a number of different groups of immigrants. So this is something that had started um, early in our history, and it continues today. And I mean, if you've watched the news, you've seen, the refugees, the people from Haiti that are coming into the United States seeking asylum, and we're sending them back. And so that's definitely an issue. Of course, we have the issue with the immigration on the southern border, and that seems to kind of amplify our sense of fear. In 1921, we had the Tulsa race massacre. Uh, and, the area of Greenwood in Tulsa was a very vibrant, very successful Black neighborhood, successful businesses, successful individuals. And white people were threatened by that. And what happened is, um, there were some people in law enforcement that really deputized white individuals and gave them guns, and they went in and they burned most, if not all, of the neighborhood to the ground, and they murdered um, citizens right on the streets. Okay, and I think that's one of those things. It's being the 100-year anniversary of that, there's been a great deal of kind of talk about what happened in 1921. But again, this is something that's not really taught in history books, so a lot of people don't know this background. And then we had in 1941, we had the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And what I thought was interesting about this, the day after Pearl Harbor was bombed, Japanese Americans were rounded up pretty quickly, and they were put in internment camps until the end of the war. And these are individuals who, some of them had no ties to Japan, but the fear was so strong that they were spies and they were sending information, that they were taken. They lost businesses. They had to walk away from their homes. Most of their possessions were taken. And they were put, in these internment camps. The other thing that was fascinating was at the time, there was a great deal of Chinese immigrants, specifically on the West Coast. And they made it a point to publicize the differences between Chinese people who were their friends, were America's friends, and Japanese people who were the enemies. So that was something that happened pretty quickly. I mean, it's amazing how quickly these individuals were rounded up. And again, it was based on fear. The next thing that I wanted to talk about, and this is something that I learned fairly recently, but after World War II, there was a move to create the United Nations and to address the issue of human rights, obviously, because we didn't want the situation that happened in Nazi Germany to happen again. It was fresh in everyone's minds. And so the noted scholar, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was one of the founding members of the NAACP, wrote this amazing appeal talking about how the current situation, the racial situation with African Americans at the time, was a violation of human rights. And so they weren't getting attention with civil rights, and Du Bois thought that this was a place that he needed to go, that he would have a response to, the lynchings, the not having healthcare, not having homes. Many of the African American servicemen that served in World War II, when they came back, they were denied access to the GI Bill, they were denied housing and things like that. And he felt that this was the proper place, and he wanted to bring awareness to these issues. And what I thought was fascinating was that Eleanor Roosevelt was on the board of the NAACP, and she took over when Franklin Roosevelt died, and she was kind of instrumental in working with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with the United Nations. And when Du Bois went to her with this statement, this document, she and some of the other members questioned him and basically said, you think that it's a human right to have housing, to have healthcare, these kinds of things. Well, that's communist, right? That's Marxist. Are you a communist? Are you a Marxist? And of course, after what had happened in World War II, that those were not good things to be called. So we've had these issues for a long time. We've known that they're issues, but the people that have the power to change things won't do it, right? And I think what was interesting about this whole situation was that the Soviets knew what the racial situation was like in the United States. And during the Cold War, that's something they wanted to play upon and put out propaganda on. And the main fear was that the Soviets would get a hold of this information and would discredit the United States, stating that, essentially we don't have our own house in order. So how can the United States go out and tell other people how to live? So that was an interesting thing that I found. And then we have the Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which ended legal segregation. The idea of, with Plessy versus Ferguson, of having, as long as there were separate facilities that were equal, it was fine. For different, for African Americans and for whites. But this, this ended that legal segregation. There were a lot of schools, particularly in the South, that didn't want to desegregate. And so they found ways around it. One institution actually in Virginia claimed that they would not desegregate and they wouldn't open, if they had to desegregate, and they closed for 5 years. The other thing that was interesting is this idea of desegregation. If you talk to, if you see reports after that was passed, you see individuals, African-American individuals saying this is one of the best things that's ever happened. And then I remember seeing a young African-American woman that responded and said, I don't want to go to their schools. They don't want me there. And I don't want to go where I'm not wanted. So even though we had what we thought was, this triumph of desegregation, it never really equaled integration. So there were still a lot of responses, negative responses to diversity. And this is something that's happening today. These are a few things that have just been happening really recently. Some of them are things that I heard some of you talking about before we started the meeting, specifically with critical race theory. But in South Dakota right now, the governor, her administration has modified state educational standards that require the teaching of the Oceti Sakowin, which are the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota native populations that occupy much of South Dakota. And their argument was that, students don't need to hear the history, they don't need to understand the culture or things like that. So if you look back on the standards, there's nothing that's threatening at all about standards. I think it would probably increase understanding between, those groups of people, but the South Dakota governor completely shut it down. We've got attacks on teaching about racism and critical race theory. This is something that's been kind of a buzzword for the last couple of years. And, I would say a lot of individuals that are speaking against it really don't understand what critical race theory is and why it's important to talk about racism, and to hear the history of racism. I can go back and all of the slides that I originally showed you where I talked about historical things that happened, I didn't learn about those until I was an adult. So these are things that are not being taught in schools for the most part. I've talked to many of my education students, and many of them hadn't been taught these things either. So I think we have a real disparity, right, in what we're teaching students. One of the more recent things that happened was this Texas law that required teachers to teach other perspectives about the Holocaust. There's a lot of questions as to what is an other perspective on the Holocaust. Is it that the Holocaust didn't happen? And that's very dangerous. It's a dangerous perspective. We've got restrictive voting laws in a number of different states. Discrimination on sexual orientation or gender identity. So, it started with the bathroom bills, and there were there was progress that was made, and then it was kind of rolled back again. And then threats to academic freedom. This is something that just recently happened in Georgia, and the Georgia state legislature is removing tenure from all, I think it's all professors in public university. So they're taking that away, and that's seen as kind of a threat against, telling the truth. And so if you look at some of these things together that are just happening, in the last 6 months to year, this is kind of perpetuating that idea that, of white superiority, that the Eurocentric perspective is the main perspective. And, unfortunately, it's a perspective that is not historically accurate. It really leaves out a great deal of things that that are happening in our country, right? And that have happened in our country. So that was really all I had in terms of historical. But I did have some questions because I know that there was an interest in having discussions. And so these are things, we don't have to stick with them, but these are things that, I thought might get us started. And the first one is the idea that, why do we respond this way? And I understand when I say we, I don't mean all of us. I guess I should say, why is this the normal or the accepted response, right, to diversity? Or if anybody else has any questions, please feel free to start the discussion. Great, Stephanie. Yeah, these are really interesting points. George Takei is probably the most, I would say that he's the one person that we all have heard of, or that most of us have heard of, that was in an internment camp, and he's tried to speak out about that. And it really is tragic to see what was done to those individuals. Forced sterilization as well. Yeah, I mean, what has happened to the native populations was, I think, especially heinous. I mean, all of these things are bad, and I think they're all things that need to be. They need to be addressed. They need to be, I guess, accepted as things that have happened, so that we can address that. Did anybody else want to share or tell me I'm wrong? That's good too.
I was typing this, but I'll just say it.
Oh, thanks, Tom.
There were similar reactions to Irish, German, and Italian immigrations, and that seems to, like, nobody, that doesn't happen anymore. And they even talk about, I suppose until the recent pandemic, but they even talk about Asian um, Americans being like a model minority. So there's, we treat some of these people differently than we used to when they first came here. But it seems that there are some groups that this never changes for. And why do you think that is?
That's really an excellent point. And you're right. Every group that came in, I mean, there was a great deal of suspicion of Germans during World War II and even during World War I. There were a lot of German immigrants who were so afraid of being associated with Germany during those wars that they stopped speaking their language, and they tried to kind of meld in with the rest of the population. I can't explain why we have these different reactions. I talked to my students about when the Irish came, and the Irish were persecuted against as well. They were blamed, and every group that's come in has been blamed for some kind of illness. I think the Jewish population was blamed for, I think, cholera, or maybe that was the Irish population. But after a while, it became cool to be Irish, right? I don't hear anybody on St. Patrick's Day complaining about Irish people, right? But I think part of that was maybe the fact that many were Catholic, and that was, different from what was here. And it actually is a historical fact that those immigrants whose cultures were more like those who initially came here, and I mean the British that came here, they had a much easier time. One of the problems, and I've talked to a couple of my professors about this, one of the issues with Asian Americans and Asian immigrants here is that they are kind of in a perpetual state of difference, because there are certain characteristics, certain, racial characteristics, ethnic characteristics that they have that I have a couple of professors who one of them was from Korea, but immigrated here when she was like 2 years old. And when she put her picture up for class, she said, "How many of you thought that I didn't speak English very well, or that I was going to have broken English?" And she speaks English perfectly because she's been here since she was 2. But, I think that's what kind of perpetuates that idea of certain groups being, stuck in this, I guess, this foreignness, so to speak. But yeah, and some groups have been able to assimilate, but they did that at a great cost. And that cost was, separating themselves from their native culture, their native language, and their customs. A lot of this happens on the southern border. If you look at Latinx immigrants that come in, it's the same thing. And in schools, many of them were punished for speaking Spanish. Most of them are not reflected in the curriculum. So they're also adapting to a new American culture, and that American culture is vastly different from their parents' cultures. So they're assimilating, but at what cost? They have that break with parents. And the only thing that I can come up with in terms of why people are treated differently like that is fear, and a belief maybe that if you're not white, if you're not Christian, then you are somehow inferior, and that drives a lot of this, or the fear that that we're going to be overtaken. And I've heard that from a number of people that I think it was originally 2030, but maybe they moved it to 2040. But at that point, white Americans are going to be the minority. And, I think that probably drives some of that fear as well. And just a general understanding of, of other cultures.
I want to add a couple comments here. One is I agree. I think that a lot of it is just based on just the fear of the unknown that we all tend to have as humans. Things that we're not familiar with, we fear them until we understand them. But the issue becomes we don't necessarily make any significant attempt to understand them unless we have to. Years ago, I spent some years doing some workshops with middle school students about cultural awareness, cultural diversity, and those things. And at the time, people use the term cultural tolerance or racially tolerant or whatever. And I always hated that term. And I explained it this way. I said, you tolerate something and you tolerate something because you can't get rid of it. And the example I always used was, if you have a headache, you tolerate the headache until you can take something to make it go away. And when you can make it go away, that's what you do. And so I feel like a lot of it is just based on the fact that, to put it bluntly, white people can't make other folks go away, so they have to tolerate it. And it's painful. But the other part of it is, I think, just the idea of the comfort of uniformity. If you think about teams and how teams function and how people function in general, even in a workplace, a big part of what makes people feel some sameness is wearing a uniform and to some degree looking the same. Well, so you mentioned that, people of Irish or German or Polish or whatever descent, generally speaking, they have similar features. There's different ethnic groups that have some outstanding features that tend to go across generations, but generally the same. So at some point, they can be more acceptable because they're wearing the same uniform, so to speak. But an African American, I like Tom, but he and I are never going to look alike, if that makes sense. And so,
Right, yeah.
And I think that's a part of it, is the comfort of being able to not just assimilate behaviorally, but the assimilation of similarity. And folks from that are that far apart in appearance are never going to appear the same. And so if I'm the majority group, then my willingness to accept folks that do not and cannot look like me is going to continue. So that's just part of what I think about it.
No, I think those are also, when you talk about this idea of never looking, that you and I will never look the same. I lost my train of thought. In terms of, I teach my students about facial gestures and how certain nonverbal communication is not the same across cultures. And one of the discussions we have is how Charles Darwin argued that our facial expressions are kind of biologically determined so that we could tell who was a friend from who was an enemy. And I wonder how much of that plays into, that's obviously a subconscious thing, but it lends credence to the idea that, people who look different are not seen as having any similarities. And I don't know. That's just something that I connected with after you mentioned that.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing. In fact, it was I don't know if it was from Darwin or not, but I heard it's kind of a tribal instinct that if you look like me, that you're more likely to be a friend. And if you don't look like me, you're likely to be an enemy. And so much of human history depended on us reacting to that because, a lot of times if you didn't look like me, I'm picking up a weapon and I'm making sure you don't take my food and raid my tribe and, that sort of thing. And our survival depended on that. Mm-hmm. I'd like to think that we're more thinking than what that instinct might cause us to react. But
Right.
we can't ignore the fact that we've got a long, thousands of years of instinct that we have to overcome.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. And that kind of leads me to the next question. Is the larger issue of power, is that the root of it? I mean, one of the things about power, and I ask my students this, if you are a person that has power, what is the thing you are most afraid of? And it's usually losing that power.
Mhm.
And so I wonder if this is just a, thousands of years of power struggle.
Well,
When we look at the Tulsa race massacre and some of the other things that have happened in the United States in terms of African American individuals, I remember watching. It was a PBS documentary called the Rise and Fall of Jim Crow. But one of the things they talked about was anytime an African American individual appeared as though they were more successful or they were becoming successful, they were kind of, rising above their place in society. That's when, issues like this happen. These massacres and all of these things happen are a result of not staying in their proper place. And I think about Native peoples, right? What did Americans believe was their proper place? If we go back to looking at the boarding schools, they were educated not for democracy, but they were educated to occupy a specific place in society. And that, there was a lot of effort to keep them in that place. And I wonder how much of that has to do with this issue of power and the fear of losing power.
well, this is where I come down on it. I think it is power, and I think it's the fear you speak of is not simply individual fear of difference. It's group fear of losing status, power, and privilege. And I think that helps to answer the previous question about why one group in particular, African Americans, regardless, remain at the bottom of the heap, are unable to fully assimilate, are unable to be recognized as equal in the sense that the Irish became white, the Italians became white, but African Americans, regardless of the color of their skin, have never been able to be white. And this is, I believe, about power. I recommend that everybody read Carol Anderson's White Rage. She talks about the 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or sometimes 1 step forward and 2 steps back in American history, when Blacks, for instance, at the end of the Civil War, achieved political power, the right to vote,
Right.
the right to own land. The backlash was ferocious and led to what's called redemption and a near century of Jim Crow, that this country was unable or unwilling to challenge until the 1960s. This is a profound part of our culture. The subordination of Blacks is part of a 400-year issue. It keeps changing. The details keep changing. The form keeps changing. But what doesn't change, in my view, is the fact of power.
Right. It's interesting that you bring up Carol Anderson, because I was reading a chapter of her book last night, and it was talking about what happened when, Du Bois wanted to go to the United Nations. But it's, I think you are absolutely right. It is all based on power. It is based on not wanting to lose power. And you're right, when African Americans were getting more rights, the right to vote and things like that, there was, these awful campaigns to stop that. And that's, I think, how the Klan was formed, was as a response to that. And that, of course, was fear and intimidation. And then, I think what we have today is we've got these, what people think are covert, but many of us see them as being overt, systemic ways that white people are trying to keep that power. And that's, it's happening with the voter suppression, and it's happening both to African American individuals, and it's also happening to Native individuals as well. But it's that system now that serves to reinforce the sense of power.
Which is not to say that all whites have power.
Right.
They don't. And some who have the least are the most insistent on their white identity. And because they need to have someone who is inferior or subordinate to them.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I think from a human perspective, this is, the things that I'm reading about human rights and history of different groups in the United States, it's very painful, and this is not going to come out the way I want it to, but it is a gut-wrenching, painful series of stories to read. And I am reading them, I'm not experiencing them. And it makes me, think about what would drive a person to do that. When white people, and this goes back, this is not a uniquely American thing. I mean, this actually dates back to, before America, this idea of one group is superior to another. Where did that idea come from? Where did that initial idea come from that it's been perpetuated for so long? Why do we need to feel that people are inferior? And that's kind of something I wrestle with in terms of, how do we address it? How, if we cannot, as a society, if we can't acknowledge the fact that, there is a system in place that is keeping people down, what hope do we have of really changing things? And I think that's what's painful about reading the history, because it's not like this just happened. I mean, this has been going on for hundreds of years.
So I hope we can recover our optimism before this is over.
I know. Yes. Well, and I think that's what it takes. It takes a handful of us that are committed to this idea of, I know that I am committed to bringing awareness. I know that that's something that I can do, is help to bring awareness. The next step, I think, is, if we can bring awareness, how do we start affecting change? What do we need to do to bring everybody together? And I wonder, America, I think white Americans, but many Americans, have become hyper individualist. And, I think that we are so individualist that we really can't see what's happening, or we don't have the energy to care about what's happening in other spheres. and I wonder if that is a component of it as well, where it's all, I'm worried about mine. I want to make sure I get mine, and the quote unquote traditional American values, meaning Eurocentric values of self-reliance, competition, material wealth, all those things are kind of connected. And they sometimes act as fodder for judging others, so a person who is, having to take welfare, is suddenly a person who is not self-reliant. Therefore, they're not sticking to the basic American values. But, I remember hearing somewhere that the welfare system, or that system of support was actually created for farmers in the Dust Bowl who lost everything. So, that type of security was initially for whites. So when did it become a negative thing, right? And so I don't, that was just a thought.
I've had a lot of conversations with family members who are in poverty about trying to make them aware about how they should say things and react to diversity in different ways. And a lot of times I try to go back to like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the fact is that when people are struggling to make money, to find housing, to get a job, it's hard for them to think about anybody but themselves so much. And so it's also hard to think that in any way that they may have power. So a lot of times I struggle with finding a way to make them understand it in a more empathetic way. So I just, I've told a family member, I'm like, imagine feeling this way and being a Black woman. And how would that be harder for you versus being a white woman in poverty or homeless? What does it look like if you're a Black woman in poverty?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I would say with the pandemic, I know that the pandemic has, I think, opened, and I don't want to say that there's anything positive about it, but when we shut down in March, it didn't take long before people started to see the inequities that existed in society. In terms of education, we know that students are more than just, somebody sitting at a desk. They come with a lot of different experiences, and many of them come from, many of them are children of trauma and have things that they're going through that impede, the education process. Just in terms of, allowing them to concentrate and learn. There is such a large amount of food insecurity. And that's, I think, one of the first things that the pandemic kind of brought to light was how many students, how many children actually get their main meals at school. I remember a former student of mine talking about, she was a teacher in a school district. And she said that she noticed one of her students putting cooked hot dogs in his pants pockets. And she pulled him aside and said, you can't do this. You can't take this food like this. It's, and he said, if I don't take this food, my family won't have anything to eat. And so she responded by saying, okay, but, putting those in your pocket is unsanitary. So why don't you come with me and let's get you some that are prepackaged. And so she addressed it that way. But I think a lot of people over the first couple of weeks realized that there is a great deal of food insecurity. And I mean, that was right at the beginning of the pandemic, where you didn't have people out of jobs for very long, right? And it just highlighted the fact that many families are living in poverty. And then, if you look at when schools went remote, that was also another kind of an inequity that was brought about. Many students didn't have internet access at home. Some of them were on dial-up. And when was the last time most of us had been on dial-up? So they would give Chromebooks to students, but if the student doesn't have, internet at home, how can that student connect? So, I think there are a lot of things, like that were brought to light. And so my hope would be that we're starting to see, we're starting to kind of recognize these things that maybe we should have recognized before, and maybe that creates the empathy that you were talking about. Because I think that's something that we desperately need in this country is, this idea of empathy. Thank you for sharing that, by the way.
Well, Mary Lynn, I want to speak on behalf of the coalition and thank you for an excellent, thought-provoking presentation. Just such a long history. It's easy to get discouraged, but I think we don't react to our discouragement by not acting. I think every little bit that we do is progress, and it'll take constant attention. And Daryl brought up the it's not enough to tolerate diversity. We have to embrace diversity. And if we can get get us and the people around us to look around and realize that we're a community that's a rich tapestry, we don't have to all look the same.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something to be gained by the differences, that in any group, it's those differences that lead to better ideas, because if everybody's thinking the same, you're all going to come up with the same ideas, and there's nothing to be gained from that. You brought up the melting pot thing, and the imagery that formed in there is that maybe we are a melting pot, but the powers that be keep stirring it until it turns white. And sometimes it will turn white, and sometimes it won't. And when it doesn't, they pick out the pieces.
Right.
Keep it from turning white, and then they churn it some more,
Right.
And, okay, now it's white again, so we're all good with it.
Right.
So that's not what the melting pot was supposed to be.
Right, exactly.
But we're going to keep working at it, and I also want to thank the people that attended today, because we're all interested in this topic, and the more we pay attention to the history of it, the more likely that we're all going to be able to change the future.
I agree.
Yeah. So yeah, maybe that this helps to maybe we can be a little bit more optimistic despite the long history of people feeling superior and forcing an inferior aspect to other people just because they're different. So I'd say let's keep at it, keep pushing and chip away at the thing, and maybe our future can be different than our past. So thank you again, Mary Lynn. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm interested in helping out in any way I can, and being part of the community. I am close to the end of my doctoral journey in diversity and equity in education, and so this is stuff that I digest on a daily basis, and that I really I'm kind of fueled by. And so if there's any way I can serve or help, I am more than happy to do that. And I have really enjoyed getting to talk to all of you and having these conversations, because I think sharing thoughts and knowing that there are people out there who are working for the same, working for progress, and that we are, close in proximity, I think is what's giving me hope. And it's kind of a way to re-energize me and you know, to want to start get it more involved in the good work, which I think it is very necessary, and it's you know, fighting for equality is and equity is that's all of my education, all of my experiences have kind of led me to this place, and so again, I really appreciate all of you and the conversations, and if there's anything I can do in the future, please let me know.
Right.
We will definitely be in touch. Thank you.
Great. Thank you
Right.
so much. I hope y'all have a great night.
Thank
All
you.
right, thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.